They say some houses don't just remember. They repeat. In 1892, the Worthington estate stood tall over the gray cliffs of Maine, its windows black as empty eyes watching the sea. Inside those walls, 6 women once lived and died, each one a bride, each one sharing the same delicate face, the same lips, the same cold smile. Locals whispered about the curse, how every generation of Worthington men married a woman who could have been her twin. No one questioned it at first, not until the night the 6th Mrs. Worthington was found in her wedding gown, sitting upright at the dining table, her reflection still fogged in the mirror beside her. They buried her with the others, thinking it was over. But some things don't stay buried in the Worthington house, because a century later, when the new owners arrived, a young couple restoring history for their dream home, they found something waiting in the attic. 6 portraits, 6 wives, 1 face, and in the faint light of dusk, the 7th canvas had already been prepared. The attic smelled of dust and time, that thick, heavy scent that clings to forgotten things and the secrets they guard. For over 100 years, no one had stepped into the Worthington attic. The floorboards were warped, the air brittle, and cobwebs hung like tattered curtains. When Amelia Clark, a young historian from Boston, first pushed open the creaking door, she expected old furniture, moth-eaten curtains, perhaps a chest or 2 filled with yellowing letters. But she didn't expect the eyes, 6 of them to be exact, all watching her from the shadows. The portraits stood in a neat, deliberate row, their frames thick with grime, their oil-painted surfaces cracked with age. At first glance, she thought they were all of the same woman, perhaps the matriarch of the family, painted over the years in different dresses. But as she wiped the dust from the first frame and read the brass plate beneath it, her pulse stuttered. Margaret Worthington, 1859. She moved to the next one. Eleanor Worthington, 1867. Then the next. Beatrice Worthington, 1875. Each portrait bore a different name, a different date, but the same haunting face. It was impossible. The same arched brows, the same soft waves of auburn hair, the same pale blue eyes that seemed to follow her across the room. Amelia leaned closer, tracing the edges of the last portrait. Catherine Worthington, 1892. The woman's painted lips were slightly parted, as if caught mid-breath, and the artist had captured an eerie lifelikeness, one that seemed too real for the century it was created in. There was no doubt about it. 6 different wives of Charles Worthington, the wealthy patriarch of the old estate. 6 women who all looked identical, and all of them were dead. The historian's rational mind tried to explain it away. Perhaps the artist had reused a model, or Charles had commissioned the portraits using a single muse. But when she checked the family registry she had found earlier, the names matched the paintings exactly, and each woman had been married to Charles Worthington in a different decade. The pattern chilled her. Each marriage, 8 years apart, each wife dying within months of her wedding. The coincidences began to crumble under the weight of their own repetition. The same face, the same death, over and over again. As the wind outside rattled the old glass panes, Amelia lit a small lantern. The dim flame flickered against the paint, casting subtle shifts in the faces of the wives. In the unsteady light, they almost seemed to change expression, sorrow deepening into rage, smiles curving into faint sneers. She stepped back, heart pounding, her shadow falling across the row of portraits like a dark stain. The attic suddenly felt too alive, as if the air itself were watching her, listening. There was something deliberate about how the portraits had been arranged, from oldest to newest, all facing the same direction, all angled slightly toward the window that overlooked the sea. When she turned toward that window, she noticed another frame lying flat under a dusty tarp. Her curiosity overpowered her unease. Pulling it free, she found no portrait at all, just a stretched blank canvas, untouched, waiting. A nameplate had already been fastened to the bottom, polished and new despite the rot around it. It read only one thing, Mrs. Worthington, 7th. The lantern flickered hard then, nearly going out, and she thought she saw a movement reflected in the attic window. Not hers, but a face staring back. The same face she had just seen 6 times. Her heart dropped as realization set in that whatever this curse was, it wasn't trapped in the past. It was patient, unfinished, and still waiting for its next subject. The townspeople of Harpswell, Maine, spoke of the Worthington brides in hushed tones, the way one might whisper about a ghost that could still be listening. The Worthington name carried weight. Old money, old property, old blood. But beneath that polished reputation ran a thread of fear that wove through generations. Every local knew the story. 6 weddings, 6 funerals, one after another, each bride dying on her wedding night. What unsettled them most wasn't just the deaths, it was what remained of the faces. They said no matter the cause, no matter the condition of the body, every Worthington bride was found with her face untouched, flawless, as if death itself refused to claim it. Some swore they saw them lying in their coffins, skin still glowing, lips still pink, eyes half open like they might awaken at any moment. Others claimed that on certain nights, when the fog rolled in from the sea, you could see those same faces reflected in the manor's upper windows, pale and motionless behind the glass. In the dim glow of the oil lamps that lined the town's harbor, the fishermen and widows told their versions of the curse. They said Charles Worthington, the patriarch, had been obsessed with beauty. His wives were always chosen not for their bloodline or wealth, but for their face, the same face. That was the strangest part, one that no one could quite explain. Each woman looked eerily alike, as though time had made no difference, as if the same spirit had stepped into a new body every few years. Some thought Charles had simply been drawn to a particular type, a preference that repeated itself like a compulsion. But others, the older ones, the ones who remembered the nights when the Manor-S lights burned past midnight, said it was darker than that. They claimed Charles was trying to preserve something, perhaps a soul, perhaps a memory. They said he made bargains with things that answered back. Every wedding followed the same pattern. The bride arrived, radiant, soft-spoken, her eyes filled with trust. The ceremony was always held inside the Worthington estate, away from the public eye, with only a few servants in attendance. Neighbors sometimes heard music, laughter, the clinking of glasses. But before dawn, silence. By morning, the carriage that had brought the bride would be seen leaving the gates, empty. When someone eventually gathered the courage to enter the manor, they would find her body, still dressed in white, resting as if she'd simply fallen asleep. Her face serene, untouched, beautiful. The doctor's reports were always vague: heart failure, shock, sudden decline. But the servants whispered about screams that echoed through the halls around midnight, and a second voice, deeper and pleading, begging something unseen to let her go. Children were warned never to wander near the cliffs where the house stood. It was said that if you stared too long into the dark windows, one of the wives would appear behind you in the reflection, her veil trailing like mist. Even the church avoided mentioning the family by name. There were no prayers for the Worthington dead, no blessings offered for their souls. Their graves, set apart from the town cemetery, were marked only by simple stones and numbers instead of names. The townspeople preferred it that way, as if erasing their names could quiet the memory of them. But memory has its own way of surviving, especially when it's soaked into the land itself. And so, long after the estate fell into ruin, the stories endured. Travelers who ventured near the cliffs at night swore they heard a woman humming an old wedding hymn carried on the wind. Others found footprints in the frost, bare, delicate, leading nowhere. The curse was more than a story now. It was a presence, a shadow that seemed to linger just beyond the edge of sight. Every generation retold the tale not just as folklore, but as a warning that love, when twisted by obsession, could outlive the flesh and find ways to wear new faces again. The storm had been building for hours when Amelia returned to the Worthington Manor's attic, her curiosity gnawing at her stronger than her fear. She had spent days studying the portraits, comparing dates and signatures, tracing each woman's short and tragic life through old newspaper clippings. But there was still a gap in the story, something missing that tied all 6 deaths together. When the rain began to drum against the windows and the sea groaned beyond the cliffs, She noticed something odd about the floorboards beneath the easel where the sixth portrait stood. They weren't nailed down like the rest. They were looser, newer, as if someone had lifted them before. With a lantern in one hand and a crowbar in the other, Amelia pried up the first board. The smell that escaped was old, sharp, and earthy, like something that had waited too long to breathe. Beneath the boards lay a hollow compartment, and inside it a trunk. It was made of blackened oak and bound with rusted iron, small enough to have been carried by hand, yet heavy with time. A tarnished brass plaque on the lid read only one word: Margaret, the first wife. She hesitated before touching it. The trunk was ice cold, colder than the air around it, as though it had been resting in another kind of darkness. When she finally lifted the latch, it gave a low, reluctant click, and the lid creaked open. Inside were objects arranged with unsettling precision: a wedding veil, folded neatly and yellowed with age, a silver hand mirror cracked down the center, a bundle of dried roses tied with a ribbon the color of dried blood. Beneath these tokens lay an old leather-bound book, a diary, brittle and half-faded, its first page marked in elegant script: "To remain beautiful, one must never truly die." Amelia's fingers trembled as she read the entries that followed. The first wife, Margaret, wrote of her love for Charles, of how he painted her endlessly, capturing her face again and again, obsessed with its perfection. But as the pages turned, her words darkened. She began describing dreams of standing beside her own body, of watching her reflection move when she did not. And then, one night, she wrote of the ritual, something Charles had learned from a book older than the house itself, one that promised eternal beauty, but only if it was shared, passed on, vessel to vessel. Beneath the diary was a small wooden box sealed with wax. Inside it lay a single silver pendant shaped like an eye. Amelia lifted it toward the lantern light, and for a fleeting second it seemed to blink, not with movement, but with a faint shimmer deep within the metal, as if it had caught something alive. She set it down, heart pounding, as the lantern flickered wildly, throwing shifting shadows across the attic. The light caught the portraits again, 6 painted faces, all serene, all watching. She noticed then what she hadn't before. On the first portrait, Margaret's hand rested on that very pendant, the same one now gleaming faintly in the trunk. On the next painting, the pendant hung around another wife's neck, and another, passed from one to the next, just as the diary had described. The wind outside howled, rattling the windows, and somewhere below, a door slammed. The air seemed to thicken, heavy with an unseen presence. Amelia knew she had uncovered something more than family history. She had found the vessel that carried the curse itself. The pendant wasn't an heirloom, it was a tether. And as she stared at it, she swore she heard a faint whisper, soft and feminine, coming from inside the trunk, repeating the same words written in Margaret's hand: "To remain beautiful, one must never truly die." The lantern dimmed then, almost to darkness, and in the thin slice of light that remained, Amelia thought she saw her own reflection in the cracked mirror. But the eyes staring back weren't hers. The diary had left Amelia shaken, but it also gave her direction. Margaret's last entry ended abruptly, mid-sentence, with a blot of ink and a faint smudge of what looked like blood. The words hinted that someone in the house had discovered the ritual, someone who'd tried to stop it but vanished before they could speak. Amelia spent the next day searching through the Manor's decaying rooms, the drawing hall with its velvet curtains turned to dust, the dining room still set for 6, and the servants' quarters, where the air hung thick with the scent of mildew and forgotten sorrow. It was there, behind a rotting panel near the old fireplace, that she found another relic of the past: a small wooden box filled with letters, receipts, and a worn journal belonging to a maid named Lydia Harrow. The date on the first page matched the year of the third wife's death. The handwriting was shaky, hurried, as if written by someone terrified of being overheard. Lydia's entries began innocently enough: mentions of her chores, of preparing rooms, of cleaning the mirrors that seemed to fill every corner of the Worthington house. But as the pages continued, her tone changed. She began to describe strange occurrences after each wedding. The nights would start with laughter, music echoing faintly from the grand hall, But around midnight the sound would shift into something else. Murmuring, chanting, then silence so deep it felt alive. Lydia claimed she once saw her master, Charles Worthington, kneeling beside his sleeping wife, whispering to her as a faint glow pulsed beneath her skin, like light trapped in glass. When she told the other servants what she'd seen, they dismissed her as tired, until the next morning when the new Mrs. Worthington was found dead, her face calm, her hands folded neatly across her chest. The diary went on to describe something more chilling. Lydia wrote that she had heard laughter in the East Wing weeks after the funeral, a woman's laughter, soft and melodic, echoing from an empty room. She followed it one night, candle in hand, only to find the door to the master's study slightly ajar. Inside, Charles sat at his easel, painting feverishly under the dim glow of candlelight. On the canvas was his late wife's face, perfect and glowing, her eyes too lifelike to be mere paint. Lydia swore she saw the lips move, just a fraction, just enough to make her drop her candle. When the light hit the floor, she saw footprints in the dust leading away from the chair where the portrait sat. The prints were bare, small, and damp, as if someone had just stepped out of the sea. Lydia's final entries were scattered, written in short, desperate bursts. She mentioned hearing voices whispering her name from the mirrors, seeing shadows move where no one stood. The last page contained a single, trembling line. "He's promised her another life, and I think he's found the way." After that, there was nothing. No record of Lydia Harrow anywhere. No obituary, no family trace. She had simply vanished from the Worthington records as though she had never existed. Amelia read and reread those words, her breath growing shallow. If Lydia's story was true, it meant that the laughter that haunted the halls wasn't just a memory. It was a continuation, a lingering presence tied to the ritual itself. That night, Amelia sat alone in the servants' quarters, the journal open beside her, when she heard it for herself. A faint laugh, lilting and distant, drifting through the corridor like a thread of song. It wasn't the sound of madness or mischief. It was familiar, intimate, a sound that made the hairs on her neck rise. It was the same tone she had imagined in Margaret's voice while reading her words, the same whisper that had come from the trunk in the attic. Slowly, she turned toward the cracked mirror on the wall. The reflection behind her shifted, the outline of a woman in a faded wedding gown, smiling with a face that had no time, no decay, no end. The laughter grew louder, and for the first time, Amelia understood what Lydia meant when she wrote that the voices never stopped. Because once you heard them, they didn't need to speak again. They stayed. Amelia had heard the laughter echo through the halls for nights now, a faint, distant melody that never seemed to come from the same place twice. She told herself it was just the house settling, wind through broken glass, her mind filling silence with superstition, but each time she tried to dismiss it, something small and deliberate would happen. A door that closed softly behind her, a reflection moving a fraction of a second too late. She'd grown accustomed to wandering the Worthington estate by lantern light, but there was one part of the manor she hadn't explored yet. The East Wing, sealed off by heavy double doors locked with a rusted chain. Every account she'd read, Lydia's diary, the newspaper clippings, the town whispers, mentioned that wing as if it didn't belong to the rest of the house. And perhaps it didn't. One stormy evening, driven by a need stronger than fear, she broke the lock. The doors creaked open with a groan that echoed down the corridor like a sigh from the house itself. The air inside was colder, stiller, carrying that faint metallic tang she had come to associate with the past, iron, paint, and the scent of rain leaking through old stone. Dust hung thick in the air, stirred only by her movement. The corridor led to a single room at the end, its door carved with intricate designs of vines and flowers, now chipped and faded. She pushed it open and froze. It was a room made entirely of mirrors. Tall panels lined every wall, some freestanding, some fixed, their silvered surfaces clouded with age, yet still reflecting light in fractured ways. Even the ceiling had mirrored tiles, cracked in places, but still capable of throwing her lantern glow into 100 trembling shards. In the center stood a circular platform, and above it hung a grand chandelier that must once have been magnificent, now draped in cobwebs. For a moment, she thought the mirrors were empty. Then she saw them. Faint outlines, faces forming in the reflections, vanishing when she blinked but reappearing when she stared too long. 6 women, standing behind her in the glass, all with the same face. Her breath caught as the light trembled. The reflections didn't mimic her movements perfectly. They lingered, turning their heads slightly slower, their eyes fixed on her rather than their own mirrored selves. It was as though they were aware, waiting. Amelia turned in circles, but the room was empty, only her reflection and theirs. The temperature dropped sharply, and her lantern began to dim. When she stepped closer to one of the mirrors, she noticed faint smudges, like fingerprints, along the inside of the glass. As she leaned closer, the reflection of her own face began to change. The corners of her mouth curled upward in a smile she wasn't making. Her eyes softened into something too familiar, too knowing. It was the same face from the portraits, alive and beautiful and terribly wrong. She stumbled backward, bumping into another mirror. The sound that followed wasn't glass meeting flesh. It was hollow, like touching something that wasn't solid. The reflection behind her shifted again, and this time all 6 faces turned toward her in unison. Their mouths moved soundlessly, lips forming words she couldn't hear but could somehow feel, echoing in her chest. She dropped the lantern, and the glass shattered, plunging the room into darkness except for the faint gleam of moonlight slipping through the curtains. In that light, she saw one final reflection, not of the 6 wives, but of herself, dressed in white. A wedding gown, a veil, her face serene, her eyes calm. For a moment she felt her heart slow, as if something unseen pressed gently against her chest. The air filled with a soft hum, like breathing. When she blinked, the image vanished, and only the cracked mirrors remained, reflecting her pale, trembling face 100 times over. But before she fled the room, something caught her attention on the farthest mirror. Faint letters, scratched into the glass, barely visible in the moonlight. She stepped closer and read them aloud. "The mirror keeps what the grave cannot." The moment the words left her lips, she felt warmth against her neck. A whisper, close and cold, repeating them back. The storm outside the Worthington estate had not stopped in days. The sea slammed against the cliffs as if trying to pull the house down, and yet the manor stood unmoved, its black windows flickering with the faint glow of Amelia's lantern. She hadn't left since discovering the mirror room, though she barely slept now, her nights consumed by reading and rereading the letters and journals she had uncovered. Each clue led to one man, Charles Worthington, the family patriarch, and the architect of the curse that had swallowed 6 lives. She found his final confession hidden where no one would have thought to look, inside the false back of his writing desk, behind a shelf of ledgers and ink bottles turned to stone. The envelope was sealed with red wax, cracked from time, and bore his signature. The ink bloomed and uneven. Inside were pages filled in the precise hand of a man who believed himself to be both genius and savior. He wrote not like a murderer, but like a scholar, documenting his obsession with an almost scientific precision. "Beauty," the first line read, "is not a gift, it is an inheritance of the soul." Charles described how he had first met Margaret, how her face had felt like recognition, as though he'd seen her long before she existed. When she died, he claimed to see her again, reborn in the next woman who crossed his path. To him, it was proof of something divine, something cyclical. But as his writing continued, it darkened. He spoke of a ritual he had discovered in a collection of occult manuscripts acquired from a shipwrecked trader. Writing said to come from a sect that worshipped the vessel of reflection, a spirit that could capture beauty forever if properly bound. The ritual demanded devotion, sacrifice, and something he called the exchange of mirrors. Through it, the soul of the beloved could be preserved, not destroyed by death, but transferred, kept alive in the reflection of another. Charles believed he had found a way to defy mortality. He described the steps in clinical detail: the night of the new moon, the offering of blood mixed with mercury, and the sealing of the reflection in a painted likeness. He had done it first with Margaret, painting her while she slept, whispering the incantations until her pulse slowed and her breath faded. Her body died, but her reflection, he wrote, lingered in the glass, smiling still. When he took another wife, he saw traces of Margaret in her, as though the spirit had chosen to inhabit the next vessel willingly. Each time he repeated the ritual, the new bride resembled the last more completely, until all 6 faces were identical. What he hadn't anticipated was the cost. His letters revealed that after the 3rd ritual, he began to hear them at night. Soft laughter in the mirrors, voices calling him by name. He claimed the wives were not content to remain reflections. They were becoming one, merging into something that no longer belonged to flesh or memory. "They have found their own will," he wrote in one trembling line. "And they look at me now as I once looked at them, with hunger." The tone of his later pages grew frantic. He tried to destroy the mirrors, but each one reappeared somewhere else in the house, whole again by morning. Servants fled, the townspeople whispered, and Charles sealed off the east wing, unable to bear the sound of their voices echoing from the glass. His final entry ended with a single sentence, ink-smeared and uneven. "I gave them eternity, and now eternity will not let me rest." Amelia sat with the letter long into the night, the lantern burning low. The wind outside screamed against the windows, and somewhere deep in the house, she thought she heard that laughter again. Faint at first, then louder, closer, surrounding her. When she turned toward the mirror above the fireplace, she saw not her reflection, but the faint outline of a man's face behind her, pale and hollow-eyed, whispering the same words she had just read. "I gave them eternity." Then, as quickly as it came, the reflection vanished, leaving only her own image trembling in the glass, her breath fogging the surface like the faintest trace of a soul that didn't belong to her. More than a century after the Worthington estate had fallen silent, the manor stood once again against the crashing waves of the Maine coast, its windows boarded, but its walls still holding the weight of all that had happened inside. Time had not erased the rumors. It had only softened them into ghost stories told to tourists passing through the town. So when Ethan Worthington, the last living descendant of Charles, purchased the old property with his fiancée Clara, the townsfolk said little. They smiled politely, offered vague congratulations, but the older ones couldn't hide the unease in their eyes. Some even muttered that the house had been waiting for its owners to return. Ethan laughed it off, chalking it up to small-town superstition, while Clara saw the place as an adventure, a chance to restore history, to breathe life back into something forgotten. They arrived one bright afternoon in late summer, unaware that the house had already begun to stir. From the beginning, Clara felt drawn to it in a way she couldn't explain. The walls, though cracked and faded, seemed familiar. The air carried a scent she swore she'd known as a child, though she had never been there before. Even the creak of the floorboards beneath her feet had a rhythm that felt like memory. Ethan was focused on the logistics, the repairs, the wiring, the plans for the renovation. Clara, however, spent her time wandering through the empty halls, her fingers grazing the wallpaper, pausing at each closed door as if listening. When she found the portraits in the attic, covered in dust but still perfectly preserved, she called out to Ethan in excitement. But when he joined her, the look on his face froze her words. He stared at the 6 portraits lined against the wall, and for a long moment he said nothing. Then, with a strained laugh, he muttered, "She looks like you." At first, Clara thought he was joking, but as she stepped closer to the nearest painting, her heart began to race. The resemblance was undeniable, the same pale blue eyes, the same auburn hair, even the same slight tilt of the chin. She studied each portrait in turn, and with each one, her unease deepened. Every woman, though painted more than a century ago, bore her face. Ethan tried to rationalize it. Artistic coincidence, perhaps some ancestor she resembled. But Clara couldn't shake the feeling that the women were watching her, recognizing her. That night she dreamed of the manor before it had decayed, filled with candlelight and laughter, and herself, or someone who looked exactly like her, standing in a white gown at the altar. When she woke, the echo of the vows still lingered faintly in her ears. Over the next few days, small things began to happen. Her reflection in the hallway mirror would seem to move a heartbeat too late. Once she caught sight of herself in the glass and saw her lips curve into a smile she hadn't made. The air in the house grew heavier, thick with whispers that faded whenever Ethan entered the room. The lights flickered at dusk, and sometimes she would hear faint humming coming from the east wing, an old melody that tugged at her in ways that felt almost tender. Ethan dismissed it all as nerves. He was proud of the family legacy, determined to rebuild the estate as a symbol of endurance. Clara didn't tell him about the dreams that were growing clearer each night. Dreams of standing before the sea, a veil fluttering around her face, the voice of a man whispering her name as she stepped toward him. On the seventh night, as the storm rolled in from the ocean, she woke to find the door of their room open, the sound of footsteps fading down the hall. Ethan was gone. She followed the sound, her bare feet cold against the wood, until she reached the east wing. The door that had been chained shut for decades now stood open. The mirror room waited beyond, faintly lit by the moon, and as she entered, the air shimmered like breath on glass. In the largest mirror, she saw Ethan standing behind her, not as he was, but as if painted, still and colorless, eyes filled with terror, and behind him, 6 women, their faces merging into one, her own. Clara's scream never reached the air. It seemed to dissolve into the stillness of the mirror room, swallowed by the heavy silence that followed. The reflection before her shifted slowly, rippling like disturbed water, until the 6 faces became one, hers. Every detail of her expression, every line of fear, mirrored perfectly, yet the woman inside the glass was calm, composed, and smiling. Clara stepped back, her breath coming in shallow bursts, but the reflection did not mimic her. It stayed perfectly still, watching her with those familiar pale blue eyes. She turned toward the door, but it had vanished, replaced by another mirror, stretching floor to ceiling. Her reflection multiplied infinitely, and in every single version of herself, the same eerie smile remained. The air grew colder, pressing down on her chest as if the house itself was breathing. Then she heard the whisper, faint, feminine, echoing from somewhere inside the glass. "You've come home." The mirrors around her began to flicker, each surface clouding with the ghostly shapes of the past. The brides, one by one, appearing in their wedding gowns. Margaret first, her veil fluttering as though moved by wind that didn't exist, followed by Eleanor, Beatrice, Ruth, Isabel, and Catherine. They surrounded Clara in reflections, each standing behind her in a world of silver light, all wearing the same face. When she blinked, they moved closer. The air filled with the low hum of distant chanting, the same words Amelia had once found in Margaret's diary. To remain beautiful, one must never truly die. Clara tried to speak, but her voice caught. The women began to turn their heads in unison toward the empty space beside her. Slowly, a shadow emerged in the reflection. Tall, male, wearing an old-fashioned suit. Charles Worthington. His eyes glowed faintly, hollow yet alive, and as he reached out his hand, the reflection of Clara stepped forward, accepting it. The glass trembled as if struck by a great wind. Clara felt the pull, a force dragging her toward the mirror's surface. She struggled, clawing at the air, but her reflection's movements were smooth and confident, almost graceful. When her fingertips brushed the glass, it wasn't cold, it was warm, pulsing like living skin. For a split second she saw something flicker deep within, 1,000 faces layered on top of one another, all her own. Then, with a sudden rush of air, her reflection reached out, grabbed her wrist, and pulled her inside. The room fell silent. The mirrors stopped flickering. And where Clara had stood moments before, there was only the faint imprint of her breath fading from the glass. The next morning, when the storm cleared, a team of contractors arrived to begin the restoration. They found the front door ajar, the lights still burning despite the power being cut, and the sound of soft humming drifting from the east wing. In the mirror room, everything was pristine. The chandelier gleamed, the floor spotless, and a new portrait hung on the wall. It was a fresh oil painting, the colors still wet, signed in the corner, Mrs. Worthington 7th. The woman in the portrait wore a white gown and a faint, knowing smile. Her eyes were alive with color, blue as the sea outside, and if one stared long enough, they seemed to blink. The workers packed up quickly that day, whispering about the sound of laughter following them down the hall. By evening, the house stood quiet again, its windows glinting in the dying light. From the cliffs below, the manor looked almost peaceful, reborn as though the years of decay had been washed away overnight. But if you watched long enough, you could see something move behind the glass, the faint outline of a woman standing where the reflection should be, her smile stretching wider, her hand pressed against the inside of the mirror as if waiting for someone to notice. The Worthington curse had begun again, and this time it had found its perfect face. So if you enjoyed this story and want to uncover more dark mysteries like this one, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.